All right, Shabbat, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Shvat, Mrs. Selma Wolf, for dedicating all of his Shemer and Joshos this month with immense gratitude for the refuahs from Hashem and in the merit of a refuah shlema for all of those in need, in the schus of our brave soldiers and in merit Hashem, and the merit of the return of our hostages, Bekarov. Matt and Diane Marks for dedicating all the Sherman, dedicating Daf Yomi today in memory of Diane's mother, Robert Zivi. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, his neshama will have an aliyah and the family in Kamma. And of course, we dedicate all of Meseches Bava Kamma Le'ilui Nishmas Master Sergeant Eliyahu Michal Charush Hashem Yikom Damo. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, his neshama will have an aliyah and the family in Kamma. So with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Ayin Aleph 71, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Ayin Base 70b at the two dots. We actually began this yesterday, but let's begin again. Ganav Umachar B'Shabbos. So I'll say it is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 lines up from the bottom. Some really very interesting and very riveting Gemara today. Supposed to remember again, the Mishnah said, Ganav Umachar B'Shabbos, that if a person went ahead and stole an animal, and sold the animal on Shabbos, said Allah Chalamaisa, I am chayiv arba v'chamisha. I am chayiv the 4 and 5 times penalty payments. Okay, so that's the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, V'hatanya pater. But we learned in the Brisa that if you stole an animal and sold it on Shabbos, said Allah Chalamaisa, you're pater. In other words, when we say pater, that means pater from arba and chamisha. You are pater from the 4 and 5 time penalty payments. So what's going on over here? How do you reconcile the Mishnah and the Brisa? So this is actually quite amazing. So the Gemara says, Amar Bar Chama says, I'll give you an explanation. Kitanya hi de pater. When the Brisa says that your pater, here's the case. But Omer Lo, we'll say this is where the purchaser says to the Ganov, Aklutz lecha te'ena miteinasi, v'tikna li gnevasech. So remember again, let's just play this out. Ruvain goes ahead and steals a sheep from Shimon on Shabbos. Okay? Now Ruvain wants to sell the sheep, so he sells it to Levi. All this happening on Shabbos. Levi obviously now has to pay, right? So in other words, Ruvain wants to sell the sheep to Levi. Levi has to pay for the sheep. So what does Levi say to Ruvain? Listen, here's the deal. I'm going to pay you for the sheep. I'm going to pay you in figs. I have a fig tree and pay you in figs. And it happens to be, Ruvain says, you know what? I'll pay you even in fresh figs. So go over to my fig tree and go cut down 10 figs for yourself. So what happens? So Ruvain goes ahead and pulls off of the tree 10 figs. Now, remember again, the act of detaching produce from a tree on Shabbos is an av malacha, one of the 39 prohibited categories of malacha, which if you do so intentionally, carries with it a death penalty. So now watch, here's the case over here. So therefore, when Ruvain is selling the object, Ruvain also incurs a death penalty. Right, so he's selling the object. So now again, there's two things happening over here. He is selling a stolen object, which generally, when it comes to livestock, would incur the 4 or 5 times penalty payments. And at the same time that he's selling the livestock, he's also incurring a death penalty. Why? Because he's detaching produce from the tree on Shabbos. So remember again, this becomes now a case of what? Kimle b'derabimine. That whenever you have an act which simultaneously results ultimately again in a death penalty and a financial liability, ultimately the financial liability is set aside in the face of the death penalty. That's what's occurring over here. So this is where, and that's why the Brisa says you're pater. So the Mishnah is just talking about Stama case where Ruvain stole on Shabbos and is selling it on Shabbos. And again, the sale is not resulting in any kind of death penalty. So in that case, he's chayiv for the financial penalty of arba v'chamisha. The Brisa, which says that you're pater, is talking about a case of simultaneity where there is both an obligation for financial liability and a death penalty. If that's the case, the death penalty sets aside the financial liability. Beautiful. I mean, not beautiful, but you understand. So take a look at Rashi over here. Actually, not yet. Yeah, look at Rashi. Akot teina, lokot teinim meteina si b'dimei hagneva b'Shabbos v'chein asa v'nis chayiv misa. So Reuven did this, and ultimately again, Reuven is now chayiv misa because he's chayiv misa. Therefore, he's going to be exempt ultimately again for the arba v'chamisha. Beautiful. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Rabbi Barcham, does this make sense? Amri v'chevan d'chitavale kaman bedina lo amrina le zil shalim. The mechayiv b'nafsho. So now listen to this. Let's play this out. Okay, so now let's go with this interpretation of the case. Right? Reuven stole the sheep from Shimon, sold it to Levi on Shabbos. Levi said, Reuven, go ahead and take your payment from the figs on my tree. So now Reuven goes ahead and does so. So now Reuven is chayiv misa for violating Shabbos. And that sets aside the financial liability. So let's play this out for just a second. Let's say now it turns out that Reuven is caught, and now Reuven has to return the object, right? Or I should say they extract the lamb, the sheep, from Levi to give it back to Shimon. So now we'll say what's going to happen? What's going to be the next situation over here? So Levi, the buyer, is going to come to Beis Din, and what is Levi going to want back in return? What is he going to want back? The figs. Right? After all, again, if there's no sale, if there's no sheep, if you're a Levi, I want my figs back. Now watch this. The Gemara says, when Levi comes to Beis Din asking for his figs back, what is Beis Din going to say? Beis Din is going to say, listen, we're not getting involved in this, because at the end of the day, Reuven is now chayiv misa as a result of the figs that he picked. So because of that, Beis Din is not going to start a legal proceedings, a financial legal proceedings, against Reuven to extract the figs and give them back to Levi, since Reuven is chayiv misa. Now watch what the Gemara says. Amri, kaman bedina. If let's say again Levi, after having the sheep taken from him and given back to its owner to Shimon, if Levi would come to us in Beis Din, right, requesting us to intervene and get his figs back from Reuven, so the Gemara says, Lo Amrina, so the Gemara says, Lo Amrina le zil shalim. We would not say to Reuven, go ahead and pay back the figs, right? Why? Because Reuven is chayiv misa, the mechayiv b'nafsho. So the Gemara says, Hamechira nami lab mechirahi. So they will say, here's what's interesting. The fact that just to play this out, the fact that if the theft were to be discovered, and let's say again the sheep would be taken from Levi, the buyer, given back to Shimon, the original owner, and now Levi were to come to Beis Din and demand restitution for his figs, we would say to him, I'm sorry, this is not a case we're getting involved in. Why? Because since Reuven is chayiv misa, we're not going to start dealing with the financial implications over here. What does that show you? What that shows you at the end of the day is that the sale wasn't really a sale. Sale wasn't really a sale. Because the sale wasn't really a sale, maybe that's why Reuven is not chayiv arba v'chamisha. In other words, you're looking at this, the reason why Reuven is pater from arba v'chamisha, because it's like a kimle b'draba minei. Like there's this simultaneity of liability, and therefore again the capital liability sets aside financial liability. Maybe not. Maybe actually the reason why there's no arba v'chamisha over here is because there's not really a sale. That's why it's not chayiv. So Amar Papa says, you're right. Let me give you a different interpretation. But remember again, all of this is an effort to go ahead and determine an explanation of the brisa, right? Remember again, the Mishnah says that if you steal and sell on Shabbos, you're chayiv arba v'chamisha. The brisa says you're pater. We're just trying to figure out the brisa. Why does the brisa say that you're pater? So the Gemara says, listen to this next. So therefore, Papa comes along and offers a different explanation. Amar Papa, ba'omer lo zrok gnevosech lechatzeri v'tikni li gnevosech. Shabbos, listen to this. Papa says, here's the case. Same scenario. In other words, Reuven stole from Shimon. It is now selling it to Levi. So Levi says to Reuven, here, do me a favor, pick up the sheep, and just throw it into my chutzner, and I'll acquire it like that. All right, we'll settle up payment afterwards, but I'll acquire it like that. Suppose says, now watch this. So the Gemara says, Kamma. Suppose says, what's happening over here? Once again, there's this simultaneity. Now remember again, if you are Reuven and you're taking a sheep from one domain, let's say you're standing in Rosh Hashanah, and you throw it into Levi's domain, what is that called? Hotzah. That's called transferring an item from one domain to another on Shabbos, which, if done intentionally, is also a malacha, carries with it liability for death, right? Death penalty. Death penalty for willingness, for willing desecration of Shabbos. So therefore, again, Rav Papa suggesting over here, that's the case. So now, one more time. Ruvain stole the sheep from Shimon, and now he's selling it to Levi. Levi says, just pick it up, throw it into my domain. So therefore, Ruvain picks it up, throws it into Levi's Rishus. So we'll see what's happening over here. Simultaneously, there's dual liability. Number one, for Arba v'chamisha, 4 and 5 time penalty payment for having sold the stolen item. And number two, liability for violation of Shabbos. So because, now once again, that's kimli b'drabamine. Whenever you have simultaneity for both death and money, the death penalty sets aside the financial liability. That's why the Brisa says that you're pater. To which the Gemara says, well, one second, Kiman, whose opinion does this reflect? Rabbi Akiva da'amar kluta k'mishuhun chadamya. Now, we'll say, remember again, this only works according to Rabbi Akiva, because what does Rabbi Akiva say? Once something enters into the airspace, right, of the domain, it's as if it is at rest. Also, remember again, we saw this machlokas back in Shabbos, back in Eruvin, when is an item considered to be at rest in the domain? Is it literally only once it hits the ground, or even once it enters into the airspace? So this is a machlokas Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan. So Rabbi Akiva holds, once it enters into the airspace, it's as if it's at rest. This is the only way this case works. Why? Dik Rabbanan, because if it's like the Rabbanan who hold that ultimately, again, something is only considered to be at rest in a domain once it hits the ground. Because of us, listen to this. According to the Rabbanan, you wouldn't have simultaneity. Why wouldn't you have simultaneity? Because from an acquisition perspective, ultimately, again, Levi will acquire the animal the moment it hits his airspace. But for a Shabbos liability perspective, there's not liability until when? Until it hits the ground. If there's no simultaneity, then you could be chayiv for two things, right? Kimle b'derabamine only works when there's simultaneity. So therefore, the Gemara is just pointing out, Rav Papa, you have a great suggestion, but your suggestion only works according to Rabbi Akiva, who holds that even for Shabbos, airspace, quote unquote, acquires, right? So therefore, again, there's simultaneity, right? Reuven lifts up the sheep, throws it into Levi's domain. Then what happens? Both in one moment, you're chayiv for Shabbos and chayiv for financial liability. So Tushim says, well, it doesn't have to be that way. You could also set it up as Ba'omer lo tikni li gnei vaseich ad shetanuach. So I'll say ultimately you could set up this case. I'm sorry, right? So also you could set this up as a situation where halacha l'maisa, the Levi said, my property will only acquire once it goes out and it hits the ground. Okay, so the point is you can make it work according to the Rabbanan as well. But I will say, but this is Rav Papa's interpretation of all of this. Beautiful. Rava says, no, not necessarily. Olam karacha. So I'm going to come back to Kluta Kimishuncha in just a little bit. Rava Amar, the Olam Krayim Barchama. So I'll say, now remember again, Rava decides to go back to Rami Bar Chama. I will say, what was Rami Bar Chama's idea? Rami Bar Chama's approach was where remember, Reuven stole from Shimon, and then went ahead and sells it to Levi. Levi says, how is Levi going to pay Reuven? He says, Reuven, pick some figs from my yard. That'll be your payment. I wanted to suggest, because now Reuven has also incurred a death penalty for willful violation of Shabbos, kotzer, ktsira, reaping, right? Oker dav mokum gidulo. There's simultaneity of liability, and therefore he's only chayiv for the death penalty. We don't set aside the money. Now, the reason why the Gemara moved on from Rami Bar Chama is because the Gemara suggested that maybe Rami Bar Chama's case is not really a sale. Why is it not really a sale? Because let's play this out. If afterwards, right, they were to discover that Reuven stole, and now what happens? Beis Din repossessed the sheep, gave it back to Shimon. Levi shows up in Beis Din and say, I want my figs back. What would we say to Levi? No, we're not getting involved in this. Since Reuven is already liable to a death penalty, we're not following up on your claim for the figs. We're just not. So the Gemara says that shows you that there was never a sale. So now the Gemara wants to go back and challenge that point. Rava Amar the Olam Krayim Bar Chama. We like Rami Bar Chama's interpretation. The Gemara says, the Gemara says, I'll give you an example. Esnan Asra Torah, Ba'afilu Baal Imo. So the Gemara uses an exaggerated case. So watch the following scenario. Right? Reuven has relations with his mother. Okay, right? Reuven's mother is a harlot, and he has relations with her. She says before they have relations, she says, okay, my fee is X, whatever the fee is. He has relations with her. He gives her the fee. Now, both say, now remember again, this is good. I want to wake everybody up a little bit over here, right? So he gives her the fee. Now, both say, now remember again, the halacha is esnan zona, money, or let's say in this case over here, an animal that a woman receives as compensation for her services cannot be offered up as a carbon. That's the halacha, esnan zona. So now watch this. So now Reuven gives his mother a sheep. Reuven gives his mother a sheep. Now watch this. Vim tavala kaman bedina. Now, okay, so that's the halacha. So now that animal cannot be offered up as a carbon. Now watch this. Let's say for argument's sake that now what happens? Reuven has relations with his mother, and he refuses to give her the sheep. She brings him to Beis Din. Right? That's one of those days where the Dayanim are like, I should have stayed in accounting, right? So I say, so now what happens? So now she brings him to Beis Din. So now Beis Din, what is Beis Din going to say to this case? Right? What's Beis Din going to say to this case? So Beis Din is going to say, whoa, you need therapy, not a Beis Din, right? In other words, we are not waiting in this case. Now there's a reason why Beis Din is not going to wait into this case. Why? Because remember again, Chayiv Misa, right? Reuven's Chayiv Misa for incest. So Lamaisa, Beis Din would not get involved in this case. Yet I will say, what's the point? What's the point? So we'll say, so now obviously Beis Din is not going to get involved and say, Reuven, you had relations with your mother, you promised her a sheep, you really owe the money. Right? Beis Din's not going to get involved in this. Yet I will say what? Yet despite all that, Afagav, Dechi Tavala Bedina, Lo Amrina Le Zil Havle, Kavan Diyavle, Have Esnan. So I will say, even though Beis Din would not get involved in this, it doesn't change the fact that the sheep that he would give her ultimately does have the status of Esnan Zona. So we'll say, so just interesting. So what the point the Gemara is making is that halacha l'maisa, just because something is not necessarily enforceable in a court of law, doesn't mean that at the end of the day, the transaction itself didn't occur. So in other words, just because Reuven's mother couldn't sue him in Beis Din ultimately, again, for Esnan Zona, doesn't mean that the animal that he would give her doesn't have the status of Esnan Zona. Similarly, again, just because in the Shabbos case, just because if Levi would come to Beis Din and say, I want my figs back, Beis Din wouldn't get involved, doesn't mean that a sale didn't occur. That's the point the Gemara is making over here. Hachanami, last line about say Hachanami, Afagav de Inyan Tashlumin, Itava Bedina Kamma Lo Amrina Leizil Shlem. So too over here, in this case, even though Levi would show up in Beis Din and say, you know what, I want my figs back, Beis Din would not get involved in this case, right? They're not getting involved in this case because Reuven is Chayiv Misa. Nevertheless, top of Ayin Aleph, Afilu Hachi, Kevan de Kamakni Lebahachi, Havi Mechira. Nevertheless, I will say it still is a valid sale. In other words, just because Beis Din wouldn't follow up on it, that's because there's another complicating legal reality that's happening over here. But Lamaisa, the sale would still be a valid sale. So therefore, I will say the Gemara seems to go back and choose to really interpret the Brayso. So therefore, what we really have is two cases. Case number one is the case of our Mishnah, which is Reuven steals a sheep from Shimon and sells it to Levi on Shabbos. All this happens on Shabbos. And what does the Mishnah say in that case? Mishnah says Reuven is chayiv arba v'chamisha. He's chayiv the 4 and 5 time penalty payment. Good. That's it. Straightforward case. Then I have a brayso that says that if Reuven stole from Shimon and sold the sheep to Levi on Shabbos, Reuven is pater from arba v'chamisha. So what's that case? Now the Gemara seems to end off by going with Rami Bar Kamma, and Rami Bar Kamma says that halacha l'maisa. It's a case of where when Reuven sells it to Levi, Levi says, okay, go take some figs from my tree as payment. So Reuven does so. So therefore, both say at the moment that Reuven is selling the object to Levi, he's also incurring a death penalty for Shabbos violation. That'll be kimle b'dirabamine, simultaneous liability, sets aside the financial liability, only chayiv for the capital liability, and that's why the Brayso says you're pater for arba v'chamisha. Beautiful. Beautiful. All right, let's go back there. Ganav Atav Yom Kippurim. So the next case in the Mishnah was that Reuven went ahead and stole and slaughtered on Yom Kippur. So the Gemara says, so now remember, in for Yom Kippur, for violation of Yom Kippur, there's a chiv kares. In general, the concept of kimne b'derabba mineh, that when there is simultaneous liability, ultimately, again, we set aside the financial liability in the face of the death penalty, only applies to misa b'dei adam. Only applies to death sentences carried out in a human court. But let's say kares, misa b'dei shamayim, which are heavenly punishments, right? Ultimately, again, the financial liability stands. So the Gemara says, Amri, Amai, nihi dekatla leka, even though you're right. So there's no death penalty imposed by a court over here. So that's why, again, if you stole and you slaughtered and sold on Shabbos, on Yom Kippur, you would be chayiv arba v'chamisha, because there's no humanly imposed death penalty. But I will say, at the end of the day, there's malchus, right? Malchus miha'ika, you get lashes. So why don't we say that because there are lashes, maybe the presence of lashes sets aside the financial liability? We have a concept that you don't get malchus and pay as well. So in other words, why not say that on Yom Kippur, even though you're right, the death sentence is not carried out in a human court, it's only done b'dei shamayim, but lamaisa, there's malchus, and maybe the presence of malchus should set aside the financial penalty. Amri Hamani, who's the pain? Is this Rabbi Meir? Rabbi Meir actually holds that you can get malchus and a financial penalty as well. Okay, so the Gemara says, Rabbi Meir, if that's Rabbi Meir, afilu tavach b'Shabbos. If that's Rabbi Meir, then ultimately, again, so if that's the case, then we should say the same thing over here by a person who steals and slaughters on Shabbos. Because Rabbi Meir would still hold that you should have to pay. So the Gemara says, v'chi tema lo ki u'mishalim islay meisu mishalim leslay. Or maybe Rabbi Meir only holds that you can get malchus and mammon, but not misa and mammon. In other words, Rabbi Meir says you could get flogged and have to pay, but there's no such thing as having a death penalty and having to pay as well. V'lo, is that true? So the Gemara says, Vatanya, we learned, Ganav v'tavach b'Shabbos, Ganav v'tavach la'avodah zara, Ganav shar haniskal utavachas. We'll say three cases over here which we're going to talk about. Case number one, right? Reuven stole and slaughtered on Shabbos. He stole and slaughtered for avodah zara, or he stole and slaughtered a shar haniskal. Shar haniskal, we'll say, means is a shar that killed someone, and therefore again is going to be stoned. We spoke about this before. It's going to be killed. It's going to be killed. So in all of these cases, if Reuven did this, mishalim arba v'chamisha div Rabbi Meir. So we'll say in all of these cases, ultimately again, you're still going to have to pay the 4 and 5 time penalty payments according to Rabbi Meir. So we'll say, so now v'cham poach and the chamim go ahead and say that you're pater. Now we'll say, just to appreciate what's happening over here, we'll discuss this a bit more, but specifically the case of Shabbos, right? In the case where Reuven goes ahead and steals the animal on Shabbos and slaughters it on Shabbos, I will say, that is a case of simultaneous liability, right? You're chayiv for theft, and you're also chayiv ultimately again for slaughtering. Now, slaughtering an animal on Shabbos is one of the lamites malachas. Yet, again, Rabbi Meir still holds that you are chayiv both Mammon and Misa. So you see from here that Rabbi Meir holds that you could be chayiv for two things, both Mammon and Misa. So the Gemara says, Amri bar minei dahi. Leave out this case. I'll tell you why. Daha itmar Allah Amr Rabbi Yaakov Amr Rabbi Yochanan from the Amr Rabbi Yirmiyah Amr Rabbi Shimon Lakish Rabbi Avin Rabbi Eloi v'chol chavrusim mishmeid Rabbi Yochanan. So a lot of people said Amri betoveach ayidei acher. This is interesting. Now let's say, what's the case over here? The case over here ultimately is, in all of these cases, we're talking about a situation where the shechita is being done by someone else. Reuven stole it. Reuven stole the object, but the shechita is being done by another party. Very interesting. And that's why there could be dual liability. Dual liability. Okay, so the Gemara says, 1 second. Let's analyze this for just a second over here. The Rebbe say, I don't understand. If Reuven's the thief and someone else is slaughtering, so then why would Reuven be chayiv arba v'chamisha? Right? In other words, Rebbe say, the way the Torah is set up is we assume we're talking about there's one guy doing all of this, right? One thief who is stealing and then subsequently slaughtering / selling. So if you have one guy stealing and someone else slaughtering and selling, why would the thief be liable arba v'chamisha? So the Gemara says, Amarava, shiny hacha da amakra utavacho macharabo. So in general, we have a concept that you're only liable for something if you're the one carrying out the maisa. This may be an exception. Why is this an exception? Because the pasuk says, when speaking about arba v'chamisha, that if you steal a sheep or a cow, you have to pay 4 or 5 times penalty. The Torah says, utavacho umacharo. Right? You went ahead and you slaughtered it, or you sold it. Now, interestingly enough, the Torah itself is linking these two processes of stealing and slaughtering to teach you what? Ma mechira al yedei acher. Now, remember again, a sale only works if what? If there's another party, right? Obviously, a seller requires another party. Af tavicha al yedei acher. So, too, again, interestingly enough, there's liability even if what? Even if the slaughter was done through someone else as well. It's interesting. So it's just a legal technicality. Someone says Dibei Rabbi Shmuel Tana O l'Rabos es hashliach. So both say Dibei Rabbi Shmuel. They said the word O in the pasuk O comes to include that even if the slaughter was done through a shaliach, ultimately again the thief would be liable. Dibei Chizkiya Tana Tachas l'Rabos es hashliach. So Dibei Chizkiya said ultimately again Tachas comes to include a shaliach and liability as well. So both say, bottom line, all three of these opinions are agreeing on the same idea, which is there's something unique over here, that even if the shechita is done through someone else, ultimately again there's liability for the thief. Liability for the thief. So again, I will say, therefore, halacha l'maisa, Reuven steals a sheep from Shimon, and he goes ahead and he gives it to Levi to slaughter. When Levi slaughters it, ultimately Reuven the thief is going to be chayiv arba v'chamisha, right? Which is unique because generally, in order to be liable for something, you have to commit the act yourself. But again, based on the drasha and the pasuk, even if a third party goes ahead and does the slaughter, the thief will be chayiv for that. Fascinating. So Maskif Mar Zutra. So Mar Zutra said, 1 second. Mi ikamidi di ilu avid ihu lo mechayiv va'avid shaliachu mechayiv. So now let me get this straight. So let's plug this in now to our case, right? So now I understand that there's liability for the thief for the 4 and 5 time penalty payment, even if he has someone else slaughter the animal. Someone else is acting on his volition. Fine. Here's my problem. It's Shabbos. Reuven goes ahead and steals an animal from Shimon. Okay? Now, Reuven gives the animal to Levi, and Levi slaughters it. So I say, now what's going to be the halacha? Reuven is chayiv arba v'chamisha. Now here's what I was saying. So now what if Reuven slaughtered that animal himself on Shabbos? What will be the halacha? Pater. Why? Kimli b'drabimine, right? So now I'll say, in general, the halacha works like this. Whatever you yourself would not be liable for, a shaliach acting on your behalf would not be liable for. So now I will say, here's the problem with this. So now, if Reuven himself were to slaughter the animal on Shabbos, he would not be chayiv arba v'chamisha, yet if a shliach does it on his behalf, he will be chayiv. That's just a strange formula. To which the Gemara says, Rashi hasam lab mishum delo mechayevu ela dekilin b'drabinei. So listen to this incredible. Rashi says, you're misunderstanding. When we say that if Reuven slaughters the animal on Shabbos, that he's not chayiv, it's not that he's not chayiv. He is chayiv. But rather what happens, there's a legal technicality. The legal technicality is that when you are liable to death and to money, so ultimately, again, the death penalty kind of just sets aside the financial liability. It's not that you're pater, you're chayiv. It's just that ultimately, again, we don't enforce that chayiv against you. So obviously, again, when a shaliach is acting on your behalf, and therefore there's no death penalty on you, the thief, ultimately we will impose the financial liability. Fascinating. So now let's analyze this. But if it's a case ultimately again where Reuven is not shechting himself, so now again let's go through this. It's Shabbos. Reuven steals an animal from Shimon, gives it to Levi. Levi slaughters it. So now again we said you're going to be chayiv 4 and 5 time penalty payments, according to Rabbi Meir. Why? So which makes sense, because now again the shechita is happening through someone else. Why would the Rabbanon say that you're pater? Why would Rabbanan say that you're pater? Amri man chachamim, who are the chachamim? Rabbi Shimon damashchita she'ena reuya lo shma shchita. So we'll say the Rabban reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon in general says that the 4 and 5 time penalty payment for slaughter only occurs with the shchita which produces an animal that is consumable. But if the shchita ultimately again is not a valid shchita, then halacha l'maisi you're not chayiv for arba v'chamisha. And we'll say now watch this. Here we go. Amri, so let's analyze this. So I understand the case where you shechted for avodah zara. The shechita is not a good shechita. Why? Because since you shechted it for avodah zara, the animal is not consumable. Shur haniskal, the halacha is once the animal is condemned to death, even if you shecht it, you're not allowed to eat it. But what about Shabbos? I don't understand, right? If Reuven is if you have a third party shechting it on Shabbos, why is the animal not consumable? Shechita reuyahi. This should be a proper shechita. Why was this? Well, first of all, it's incredible that we're learning Hilchos Shabbos on Erev Shabbos, which is also just like a fascinating confluence of events. So we'll say, now watch this. This nan hashochit b'Shabbos Yom Kippurim. If a person shechts an animal on Shabbos or on Yom Kippur, so first white line, what's the halacha? Will say if you shecht an animal on Shabbos and Yom Kippur, even though there is liability, capital liability, for shechting an animal on Shabbos, but the shechita is a good shechita, the animal is kosher. The animal is kosher. So if the animal is kosher, we'll say, so ultimately again, why would the Rabbanon say that's your pater? Why would the Rabbanon say that's your pater? To which the Gemara says, Amri, listen to this. Here we go. We're getting into the kishkas of Hilchos Shabbos, which is really exciting. So we'll say it must be that the Rabbanon, who hold like Rabbi Shimon, I should say the Chachamim, hold like Rabbi Shimon, also like Rabbi Yochanan Sandler. What did Rabbi Yochanan Sandler say? This nan, Hamavashal b'Shabbos b'Shogeg. Watch this. A person cooks on Shabbos accidentally. Right? Accidentally, I forgot it was Shabbos, or I didn't know that cooking is prohibited on Shabbos. Okay, so what's the halacha? B'shogeg, if you did it accidentally, yochal, you are allowed to consume the products of your labor. B'mezid lo yochal d'Rabbi Meir. But if you did it intentionally, Rabbi Meir holds, you're not allowed to. So again, I wake up Shabbos morning, I forgot that at Shabbos I made myself some scrambled eggs. So again, shogeg, I forgot, I didn't know it was Shabbos, or I didn't know that cooking is asur on Shabbos. So again, Rabbi Meir says, you're allowed to eat it. But if you did it intentionally, you're not allowed to eat that which you cooked. Okay, that's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says, "B'shogeg yochal b'matzeh Shabbos, b'meizil yochal." So Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. He says, if you cooked accidentally, you're allowed to eat it, but when? On Matzeh Shabbos. You can't benefit on Shabbos from any intentional malacha that you did. And if you did it intentionally, you're never allowed to eat it. Rabbi Yochanan Sandler says, "B'shogeg yochal b'matzeh Shabbos la'acherim v'lo lo." Rabbi Yochanan Sandler says, if you cooked accidentally on Shabbos, you could be consumed on Matzah Shabbos. For who? Other people. But you, the perpetrator, you're never allowed to eat it. B'mezid lo yochal olamis lo lo v'lo la'acherim. But if you did it intentionally, no one is ever allowed to eat it. So therefore I will say, watch this. So the Gemara says, well, let's finish up. So before we go on, the Gemara wants to just like this. So therefore, the Chachamim who say, let's go back, right? Reuven steals an animal from on Shabbos from Shimon, and now gives it to Levi to slaughter. Levi slaughters it. So ultimately, again, remember, Rabbi Meir says you're chayiv. Rabbi Meir says you're chayiv, right? Because remember again, so the person who stole it is not the person who's slaughtering it, but yet the person who stole it is still liable for the slaughter. But because there's no kiyum b'drabine, he's going to be chayiv arba v'chamisha. The Chum say that you're pater. Now we're trying to figure out, why did the Chum say that you're pater? Oh, I'll tell you why. Because the Chum hold like Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says any shechita that doesn't result in a consumable animal, you're not chayiv arba v'chamisha. Okay, so therefore, and in addition, they also like Rabbi Yochanan Sandler. Rabbi Yochanan Sandler says, anytime you intentionally do a malacha on Shabbos, the results of that malacha are prohibited to you forever. So therefore, it turns out that when Reuven steals from Shimon on Shabbos, gives it to Levi shechts it, that shechita results in an animal that is not consumable by the thief, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, you're pater from arba v'chamisha. Beautiful. That's the position of my time back in Shabbos. My time of Rabbi Yochanan Sandler. What's Rabbi Yochanan Sandler's logic? Why does Rabbi Yochanan Sandler say that halacha l'maisa, if you intentionally violate Shabbos, In this case, it's cooking. You intentionally cook on Shabbos. Ultimately, the results are usher for you and for everyone forever. So the Gemara says, "Kididarish Rabbi Chia apischa de benesia." As Rabbi Chia darshed at the end of the house of the Nasi, ushmartem es Shabbos ki kodesh hilochem. You shall guard. We'll say it's beautiful to do this on Erev Shabbos. No, incredible. Ushmartem es Shabbos ki kodesh hilochem. We'll say you should go ahead and literally again guard the Shabbos, for it is kodesh to you. Ma kodesh aser ba'achila, just like I will say something consecrated is prohibited for consumption. Af ma'aseh Shabbos asurin ba'achila. So to will say anything you cook on Shabbos is also going to be prohibited for consumption. It's beautiful. Ima kodesh aser ba'ana af ma'aseh Shabbos aser ba'ana. But if you're comparing, right? If you're comparing food cooked on Shabbos to hektish, we should say, just like hektish is asar ba'ana, so too again anything you cook on Shabbos should also be asar ba'ana. Talmud lomar lachem. Therefore the pasuk says lachem ki kodesh lachem shalachem yehei. Ultimately again, even though you can't eat it, you can get benefit from it. So we'll say, so according to Rabbi Yochanan Sandler, the Torah compares anything cooked on Shabbos to hektish. Just like hektish can't be consumed, so too anything you cook on Shabbos can't be consumed. But unlike hektish, which is asar ba'ana, for benefit, anything you produce on Shabbos lachem, you can still get hana from it. Incredible. Someone says, Yachafilu b'shogeg. You might have thought this is true even if you did it b'shogeg. Talmud lomar, mechalaleha, most you must. The pasuk says, by Shabbos violation, those who violate it will be put to death. But meizin amarti lecha v'lo b'shogeg. Ultimately, again, there's only liability ultimately for intentional violation of Shabbos, but not b'shogeg. So therefore, Rabbi say that rounds out the position. So the position of the Chachamim who say that if you go ahead and you steal an animal on Shabbos, right? Reuven steals from Shimon, gives it to Levi to slaughter, right? Reuven is not going to be chayiv arba v'chamisha. Why? Because since that slaughter does not produce a shchita ru'uyah, does not produce an animal that is consumable, based on the positions of Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan Sandler, therefore you're not chayiv arba v'chamisha. This is the machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Meir. Say it's actually very beautiful. I mentioned this a number of times on that pasuk of ushmartem es Shabbos. So again, Rabbi Soloveitchik says very apropos. Rabbi Soloveitchik spoke about the idea that he found that one of the greatest distinctions between his youth in Europe and his adult life in America, he said in America there are many Shomrei Shabbos. Shomrei Shabbos, right? But in America, he said there are very few Shomrei Erev Shabbos. He says he remembers from his youth that people were Shomer Erev Shabbos. That what happened? On Erev Shabbos already again, there was a preparation for Shabbos. There was no running in the 18 minutes of Shabbos, right? There was no last minute preparations. That a person should go into Shabbos, benachos. Person should be prepared. Plan your day accordingly. Of course, the last minute things, could it happen last minute things? Of course, I would say, but a person knows, you know what's on your calendar, so you know that if you have meetings at 2:30 on Erev Shabbos, when Shabbos starts at whatever it is, 4:45, that is going to be a problem. You're not going to be Shomer Erev Shabbos in a situation like that. So I will say, so again, sometimes you don't have control, but when you do have control, Ushmartem es Shabbos is not just the din from candle lighting and on. Ushmartem es Shabbos ultimately again is a din already being shomer Erev Shabbos Azal. This is a good plug. You can also see Reb Jacob Milner for any Tuameh sponsorships, right? Again, I'll say this is why we go into Shabbos. Tuameh, again, you go in, you prepare a little bit. It's a different kind of Shabbos when a person is running in by the seat of their pants versus when a person goes in benachos. A person is ready for Shabbos, a shomer Erev Shabbos. Very important din in our Shemir Shabbos. Pligi bar Avacha v'Ravina. So here we go. So we'll say now we're a little bit steeped in Hilchos Shabbos. Upligi baravacha v'Ravina. Chad amar ma'aseh Shabbos daraisa, v'chad amar ma'aseh Shabbos d'Rabbanan. Well, this is interesting. Machlokes Ravacha and Ravina. We'll say when we say. So now we've established, I will say, that if you cook on Shabbos intentionally, the results of your labor are prohibited. Now I'll say, so again, machlokes in how prohibited. Prohibited on Shabbos, after Shabbos, for you, for other people. Here's the shaila. When we say that which you cook on Shabbos is asur, is that an isur da'araisa or an isur d'Rabbanan? So the Gemara says, Chad Amar Isser Daraisa. So Chad Amar Ma'aser Shabbos Daraisa. Chad Amar Ma'aser Shabbos Daraisa. Machlokes Man Amar Daraisa Kida Amar. So the opinion that says that it's Asur Daraisa. That's what we just saw. Ushmartem Es Shabbos Ki Kodesh Ilachem. We compare, right? We compare that which was cooked on Shabbos ultimately again to Hekdish. Hekdish. Uman Amar Drabanan Amar Kodesh. So the Gemara says, Umanda Amar Drabanan Amar Kra Kodesh Who Kodesh? Vein Ma'asav Kodesh. The other opinion will say Shabbos is Kodesh, but ultimately, again, that which you produce on Shabbos, like that which you cook on Shabbos, that's not going to be Kodesh. In other words, that'll be Asr, but only Asr Midrabanan. So, Bishlo Lamandar Medaraisa. So the one who says that anything that you cook or produce on Shabbos is Asr Midrabanan, Amatul Haki Amabeis Amatul Haki Pachrabanan. So I will say that makes sense. That's why, according to the Rabbanon, ultimately again you're going to be potter, right? Remember again that remember going back for just a second. According to the Rabbanon, if I go ahead, right, or Reuven goes in and steals an animal from Shimon, right, gives that animal to Levi, because we're talking about now a third party. Levi shechts the animal for the thief for Reuven. What's going to be the halacha? Reuven is potter for arba v'chamisha. Why? Because it's a shchita she'ena ru'uya. Why is it an unfit shchita? Because anything you go ahead and you produce on Shabbos is going to be aser mid'oraisa. So that animal is not consumable. And if you go with the position of Rabbi Shimon, that is shchita she'ena ru'uya, not chayv for arba v'chamisha, that's why it makes sense that you're potter. Elaman da'amar d'Rabbanan, amai patri Rabbanan. But according to the opinion that says, that halacha l'maisa, Maisa Shabbos, anything you produce on Shabbos is only asr midrabanan. So why would the Rabbanan exempt the thief from arba v'chamisha? To which Gemara says, you're right. According to this approach, ashara avodah zara v'shar niskal. You're right. I will say in that case, when the Rabbanan say that you're potter, they're not going on the Shabbos case, rather they're going on the avodah zara case and the shar haniskal case. Okay, so let's analyze those cases a bit. Rabbi Meir, amay mechayiv shochel avodah zara. So we'll say, let's go back for just a second. Now remember again, Rabbi Meir said, I will say, right, one of the cases that we had, machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim, was Reuven goes ahead and steals an animal and he shechts it for avodah zara. He shechts it for avodah zara. Rabbi Meir said you're chayiv, and ultimately, again, the Chachamim say that you're potter. Why would Rabbi Meir say that you're chayiv arba v'chamisha in that case? After all, kevan de shachat baparta asra. Now the way it works like this. The way it works is like this. If Reuven steals an animal from Shimon and now shechts it for avodah zara, Rabbi say the moment he begins that shchita, right, the first little nick that he does for avodah zara, that animal is asr. That animal is avodah zara now. If that's the case, idach isuri hanahu v'lav demari katalach. So we'll say if that's the case, then you don't have simultaneity over here. Then really what happens is like this. The moment he begins the cut, the animal is now avodah zara. Once the animal is avodah zara, that means it no longer belongs to its owner. If it no longer belongs to its owner, v'lo didei katalach, then ultimately again he's not shechting his own animal, or he's not shechting. So right, Reuven's not shechting his animal, he's not shechting the animal of Shimon, he's shechting an animal of avodah zara. If that's the case, then what? Then although there should be liability for theft, there shouldn't be liability for arba v'chamisha. Incredible. So I'll say, so at the end of the day, now here's what's fascinating. The assumption the Gemara is working under is, when do you become chayiv for arba v'chamisha? When is there liability for that? At the completion of shchita. So we'll say, watch what's happening over here. When is there liability for offering an animal for avodah zara? The moment you make a nick in that animal. Right? So the moment you begin a shchita, you're a chayiv for avodah zara. So yet, liability for arba v'chamisha only occurs when? At the end of the shchita. The problem is, by the time you get to the end of the shchita, whose animal is that? It's avodah zara animal already. Well, if it's avodah zara animal already, then there shouldn't be liability for arba v'chamisha. You hear the interesting catch 22 over here. You're only chayiv arba v'chamisha if you shecht the animal that you stole from Shimon, meaning that it's Shimon's animal. But by the time you get to the end of the shchita, it's avodah zara's animal already. So again, granted, I'm going to be chayiv for theft, and I'm going to be chayiv for avodah zara, but I should not be chayiv for arba v'chamisha. To which the Gemara says, Amar Rava, ba'omer bigmar zvicha hava ovda. But say, no, the case over here is where Reuven says, I'm offering up this animal for avodah zara, but I only want it to become avodah zara animal at the end of the shchita. Okay, in which case they'll be simultaneous. But remember again, Rabbi Meir holds that you're chayiv for simultaneous liability. Okay, shar niskal. Let's go back. We'll say what's shar niskal. Shar niskal. We'll say remember again is the case bepashtus where Ruvain stole from Shimon. Ruvain stole from Shimon an animal. Now remember, this animal was condemned to die already. We'll say little chazran Bava Kamma. When would you have an animal that's condemned to die? When is the animal condemned to die? Right? Animal killed someone, right? So Shimon's animal killed someone, but yet Shimon still has it. Reuven stole that animal from him, right? And now shechts it or sells it. So now Rabbi Meir said, "Yechayv arba v'chamisha." But why? Shar niskal isurei hananinu lav demarika tavach. I will say essentially, right when Reuven steals a shar haniskal from Shimon, what has Reuven done? What has Reuven done? Not really anything. That animal is prohibited from benefits from Shimon already to begin with. So why should there be arba v'chamisha liability? What's the case? It's actually interesting. The case of a kind of alluded case over here. Kigon shemasu l'shomer. I will say here's the case. Right. We'll call him Shimon. Shimon had an animal. Shimon gave the animal to Ruvain to be a shomer. Okay, v'hizik bebeis hashomer v'hua bebeis hashomer v'nigbar dino beis hashomer. I'm saying now what happened? Ruvain, while the animal was with Ruvain, so the animal ultimately again did all of this damage and essentially became a muad and now liable to death under the domain or while under the watch ultimately of Ruvain. Okay, so now watch this. Rabbi Meir, Savalak Rabbi Yaakov, Savalak Rabbi Shimon. Okay, so we'll say just hold on to this for just a second. Rabbi Meir holds like Rabbi Yaakov and he holds like Rabbi Shimon. What does that mean? Savalak Rabbi Yaakov, the Amar, Af mishenigmar dino, hechziro shomer lebailim muchzar. But so remember again, we just actually had this case a couple of days ago with chametz. We'll say, if let's say something happens to change the status of something, but the change in status is unrecognizable, what do we call hazek shein or nikar? Can you return the item in its current state to its owner and fulfill your obligation of returns? We'll say, remember, I'll give you a simple example, right? So let's take this case. Shimon entrusted his animal with Ruvain. So what happens now? Ruvain, while it was with Ruvain, now let's say it became a shar niskal. The animal killed someone. So now Ruvain brings the animal back to Shimon. He says, okay, just returning your animal, have a great day. Right? So we'll say, so now the shaila is, does that work? On one hand, has Ruvain returned the animal entrusted with him? Yeah. Absolutely. Only one little smidge of a detail over here, which is that what? This animal is now liable to a death penalty and therefore it's worthless. So we'll say, so the shaila is, when you return a worthless but fully intact and externally same animal that was given to you, right, is that considered to be a proper return? So Rabbi Yaakov holds, yes. Rabbi Yaakov said, remember again, this is the same case, remember, so we saw before, where Ruvain stole chametz from Shimon before Pesach, and then ultimately again, after Pesach, Ruvain decides to become a Baal Tshuva, and gives back, the box of Entenmann's donuts, says, here, I'm giving you back the donuts. That's great, but the donuts before Pesach were worth something, now after Pesach it's worth zero. So Rabbi Yaakov holds that halacha l'maisa hazek shein or nikar lo shmei hazek. That at the end of the day, if the object is intact and you return it, you fulfilled your obligation. So therefore, again, that's how Rabbi Meir holds. Number one, Rabbi Shimon the Amar, and he says furthermore again something that ultimately causes money or someone that ultimately can result in a financial claim is like money itself. This not Rabbi Shimon Omer kachim shechayiv b'achriyusan chayiv. Did I say ultimately again a carbon, right? If you steal a carbon that the owner ultimately has financial liability for, ultimately again you're chayiv. Alma, davar hagarin l'mamon kimamon dami. So therefore halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Meir would hold like both of these opinions, like Rabbi Yaakov and like Rabbi Shimon, and that would ultimately again result in liability even for an avodah zarah animal. Okay, Rav Kana, I said this over in front of Rav Zira Narda. Mi matzis mukmas masnesi Rabbi Meir, v'lo Rabbi Shimon. So are you setting up our Mishnah like Rabbi Meir, not like Rabbi Shimon? So the Gemara says, "V'hakatani seifa." Look at the seifa. Rabbi Shimon poter b'shnei elu. The Rabbi Shimon ultimately paters in both of these cases. I will say the last two cases of the Mishnah. Mechlad debekula masnisin moda. I will say that sounds like over in the rest of the Mishnah. He ultimately again would agree. Amalei lav mechlal demoda betavach umachar. So we'll say, no. All it means, we'll say all it means ultimately again is that what? Is that halacha l'maisa Here, take a look, by the way. I'm sorry, let me just go back to this for just a second. So the Gemara says, one more time, Rav Kana said this over in front of Rav Zira of Narda. And he says, Mi matis mukmas masiz Rabbi Meir. Do you really think that it's possible to establish our mission like Rabbi Meir? Look at Rashi, just a moment. Mitzvah matis muklumas nisin, the gun of a tav of Yomi Kippur and Rabbi Meir, l'chudei, damar loka mashalim. So remember again, earlier in the Mishnah spoke about the case of a person who steals and sells on Yom Kippur. So ultimately, again, can you set this up like Rabbi Meir, like we were just trying to do? After all, again, I will say, look at the end of the Mishnah. What did the end of the Mishnah say? The end of the Mishnah said, right, Rabbi Shimon poter b'shnei elu. Rabbi Shimon pottered in those two cases. And the fact that we mentioned Rabbi Shimon by name at the Seifa seems to indicate that what? Michlal debekula masnisin moda. Sounds like by the rest of the Mishnah, ultimately again, that he's moda. To which the Gemara says, Amarlei lo michlal de moda betavach umachar l'refua v'leklavim. Take a look at Rashi. L'refua v'leklavim. Vistrech l'sonavos is coming to tell us that Rabbi Shimon is moda in the case ultimately where a person slaughters for the purpose of refuah, medicinal purposes, and for giving to eat to his dogs. Now, what's the chiddush in there? Look at Rashi. L'refua v'leklavim. Vistrech lashmuinan afagav Rabbi Shimon shchita shen ruya loshma shchita. So it's actually a different discussion which we're going to get into, that even though Rabbi Shimon himself, Rabbi holds that halacha l'maisa, that when you shecht, in order for there to be liability, has to be a shchita ru'uya, right? And therefore, again, if you shecht for a shchita shenari, which means a shchita that is not for consumption purposes, ultimately, again, you're not chayav arba v'chamisha. Even Rabbi Shimon would agree in a case where you shecht for either medicinal purposes or to give to the dogs. That's called the shchita ru'uya. That is called a proper shchita since it serves a defined purpose. Finish up in Rashi. He says, "Hach shchita ru'uya kachashiv la aval b'yom kippurim pligi mishum de'en lo kemushalim." Good. Shabbos says, therefore, Allah Chalamayim says, just coming to say Rabbi Shimon. So again, it's just coming to say in those last two cases that even Rabbi Shimon would agree with that. So therefore, Rabbi say, what comes out over here is something really fascinating. So therefore, Rabbi say, okay, there's a lot that comes out over here. Rabbi say, but bottom line, what we see is that Allah Chalamayim we really spent the majority of our time focusing on this machlokes, Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim, and ultimately, again, reconciling all of these cases. So I will say what comes out essentially is Ara v'chamisha will only be incurred in a situation where there's no kimlim b'derabba minei. But if there's kimlim b'derabba minei, obviously, again, you get the death penalty. We set aside the Ara v'chamisha. Shita of Rabbi Shimon, does it have to be a shchita ru'uya, shchita she'ena ru'uya, ultimately still requires us to go ahead and determine in our sugyas to come. I will say I just want to end off with one last piece. We began the day today. I want to make sure we finish the Gemara first before we went into this. We began the day today with an interesting machlokes about kluta kimishahuncha. Machlokes Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan about when an item goes through airspace but doesn't land in that domain, is it considered to be as if it came to rest or not? So Rabbi Akiva paskins that we hold kluta kimishahuncha damya. Right? Ultimately, if an item goes through an airspace, it's as if it came to rest in that domain. So I was thinking about this concept, that I think that there's a tremendous Musar Haskell in this as well. The Musar Haskell, Kluta Kamishuncha, what does it mean? And I will say, sometimes in life, so we have moments of incredible growth and moments of incredible aliyah, right? Moments of like inspiration and moments where I have I really, on a spiritual level, I have it together. And then what happens, Rabbi was saying? We have those moments, and then what happens? We kind of just keep moving. We keep moving, right? And we don't retain that growth. And a lot of times in life we think that halacha l'maisa, if you just have like episodic moments of growth and episodic moments of connection and episodic moments of aliyah, they're meaningless. If it's not consistent and if you can't retain it, it doesn't mean anything. And comes along Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva says that's incorrect. Rabbi Akiva says, Kluta kamishahun chadamya. Sometimes, even when you're just passing through an area, it's as if you came to rest. Even sometimes just passing through spirituality, even if you don't remain there, still is a meaningful moment. That Allah, even if you don't come to rest in the place of spiritual growth, but you just pass through, that's meaningful also. Meaningful moments of aliyah, meaningful moments of inspiration, meaningful moments of growth, even if they're not sustained, even if you don't come to rest in that space of spiritual growth, but you just pass through, those are meaningful also. I'll say again, we have to give ourselves credit, even for the episodic moments of growth, even if we're not able to maintain or ultimately sustain them. Obviously, our goal is to maintain spiritual growth, to go ahead and facilitate and constantly nurture spiritual growth. But even if we just pass through for a moment here or there, understand the profundity of those moments as well. Rabbi say, Shkoyach, good Shabbos, a wonderful week of learning together. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great Shabbos, everyone.